Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. It began with a whisper. Travelers along lonely highways spoke of a strange town that wasn't on any map, a place that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The stories were always the same, a cluster of weathered buildings, dimly lit streets, and a strange sense of stillness that lingered in the air. Locals from neighboring towns called it Willowshade, though no one seemed to know why. The town wasn't fixed. It moved every night, vanishing as the sun rose and reappearing miles away. To most, the stories were nothing more than urban legends, tales to scare young wanderers. But for those who had seen Willowshade, the experience was unforgettable and haunting. Lena Morgan first heard about Willowshade during her shift at the roadside diner where she worked as a waitress. It was late, and the place was nearly empty, save for a trucker nursing a cup of black coffee and a slice of pie. He was a regular, always coming through town on his cross-country routes. "You ever heard of a town that just shows up?" he asked casually, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from his coffee. "A ghost town?" Lena asked, smirking as she wiped down the counter. "Not exactly. It's real. Streets, houses, people and all. But it ain't always in the same place. I saw it once. Pulled off the road at night to take a break, and there it was, like it had always been there. But by morning, it was gone. Thought I was losing my mind till I heard others talking about it." Lena laughed. "You've been driving too long. Probably dreamed it." The trucker shook his head. "I ain't the only one. You ask around, you'll hear the same thing. But I'll tell you this, if you ever find it, don't stay too long. Folks say it doesn't let everyone leave." That night as Lena drove home, the trucker's words stuck with her. She told herself it was just a story, but part of her, a small, curious part, wanted to see this phantom town for herself. 2 weeks later, Lena was driving home from a late shift. The highway stretched endlessly before her, bathed in the pale glow of her headlights. The radio crackled faintly, unable to hold a signal, and the surrounding darkness felt thicker than usual. Then she saw it. Up ahead, where she was certain there had only been empty fields the night before, there were now lights. Street lights, faint and flickering, lined a narrow road that seemed to lead into a small town. Her pulse quickened. The trucker's story flooded her mind. Curiosity got the better of her. She slowed her car and turned onto the road, the tires crunching over gravel. The air felt different here, heavier, colder. As she drove deeper into the town, she saw rows of old-fashioned buildings, their windows glowing with soft, golden light. A diner, a general store, a post office, all the hallmarks of a quaint, forgotten town. The streets were empty, but everything looked meticulously maintained. Fresh paint on the buildings, flower boxes brimming with vibrant blooms, and not a single sign of decay. It was as if the town had been frozen in time. Lena parked her car outside the diner and stepped out, her breath visible in the chilly night air. The door to the diner swung open with a faint creak, as if inviting her in. Against her better judgment, she crossed the threshold. The diner was immaculate. Chrome stools gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the jukebox in the corner hummed faintly, though no music played. A woman in a pale blue uniform stood behind the counter, wiping a glass. She looked up and smiled warmly. "Welcome to Willowshade," she said. Her voice was pleasant, but something about her tone unsettled Lena. "Hi," Lena said, forcing a smile. "This place, it wasn't here yesterday." The woman tilted her head. "Willowshade moves around. It has a way of finding those who need it." "Need it?" Lena echoed. I mean, I wasn't looking for it. The woman's smile didn't falter. Sometimes it's the other way around. Can I get you something? Coffee? Pie? Lena hesitated but nodded. Coffee, please. As the woman poured a steaming cup, Lena glanced around the room. The booths were empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. The woman set the coffee in front of her. You might not remember everything, but Willowshade remembers you. What does that mean? Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's expression softened. Everyone who comes here has a past, something they've left behind, something they're running from. Willowshade has a way of showing people what they need to see. Before Lena could respond, the door swung open. A man stumbled in, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. They're coming, the man gasped, his voice shaking. They always come. The woman behind the counter didn't seem alarmed. She simply nodded and gestured for the man to sit. He collapsed into a booth, clutching his head. Lena turned to the woman. What's going on? Who's coming? The woman sighed. Willowshade isn't just a town. It's a place between places. And sometimes things follow those who find it. What things? Lena asked, her heart racing. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she looked at Lena with piercing eyes. You should leave before sunrise. If you stay too long, the town won't let you go. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. She grabbed her coat and hurried outside. But as she stepped onto the street, she froze. The town had changed. Buildings that had been neat and orderly were now crumbling and covered in vines. The warm glow of the streetlights had turned into a sickly green hue. Shadows moved in the alleys, slinking closer with every passing second. A low, guttural whisper filled the air, echoing in Lena's ears. She turned back to the diner, but the door was gone, replaced by a solid brick wall. Panic set in. Lena ran down the street, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The town seemed to shift around her, the streets twisting and turning like a living maze. No matter which direction she ran, she couldn't find her car. The whispers grew louder, forming words now. You can't leave. You belong here, Lena screamed, clutching her head as the shadows closed in. But just as she felt herself slipping into despair, she saw it. The narrow gravel road she had driven in on, stretching out toward the highway. With every ounce of strength she had left, she sprinted toward it. The shadows lunged after her, their cold, claw-like fingers brushing against her back. But she didn't stop. She ran until she burst onto the highway, collapsing in the middle of the road. When she looked back, Willowshade was gone. Lena never told anyone what had happened that night. The trucker's story had been true, and she had barely escaped with her life. But the experience left her with more questions than answers. Why had the town appeared to her? What had it meant when the woman said Willowshade remembered her? And what would have happened if she hadn't escaped before sunrise? Months later, she heard another story, this time from a stranger at the diner. They spoke of a mysterious town that appeared and disappeared, a place that showed people their greatest fears and regrets. Lena said nothing, but deep down, she knew the truth. Willowshade wasn't just a phantom town. It was a reflection of the soul, a place that exposed what was hidden and forced its visitors to confront the darkest corners of their hearts. And somewhere, out there in the shifting darkness, it was still waiting. The pond lay deep in the heart of the Whispering Woods, a place most people avoided. Overgrown paths, twisted trees, and the eerie, constant murmur of unseen winds kept casual visitors at bay. But those who ventured far enough, those with a reason to seek it, found the pond, a still, glass-like body of water that seemed to pull at the very edges of their mind. The locals called it the Mirror Pond, but its true nature was something whispered only in rumors. It was said the pond didn't reflect the present. It reflected the forgotten, the fragments of memory buried so deep that even the mind had discarded them. But the pond never gave its gifts freely. Those who stared into its surface often left changed, burdened by truths they weren't ready to face. Elena Harper had never been to the Whispering Woods. Growing up in the nearby village, she'd heard the stories, just like everyone else. But she'd always dismissed them as fanciful myths meant to scare children. That changed after her mother died. The passing itself wasn't a shock. Her mother had been sick for years. But what haunted Elena was the sense of loss that extended beyond grief. There were gaps in her memory, pieces of her childhood that felt out of reach. Every time she tried to remember the sound of her mother's voice or the warmth of her embrace, she felt a strange emptiness, as if those moments had been stolen from her. One night, while sorting through her mother's belongings, Elena found a faded photograph tucked into the corner of an old jewelry box. It showed a younger version of her mother standing by a pond, her reflection shimmering faintly on the surface. On the back of the photo, in her mother's elegant handwriting, were the words, "The mirror pond will show what time takes." Elena's heart raced as she stared at the photo. The stories she had dismissed as superstition suddenly felt more real. If the pond could show her the memories she had lost, she had to find it. The next morning, Elena set off for the Whispering Woods. She packed lightly, some food, a flashlight, and a small notebook to document what she found. The villagers warned her not to go. "The woods aren't safe," said one elderly man at the general store. "People get lost in there, and if they come back, they're never the same." Elena nodded politely but didn't heed the warnings. Her determination outweighed her fear. The woods were as intimidating as the stories described. The trees were ancient, their gnarled branches twisting together to block out the sun. The air felt thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness. As she walked, the faint whispers began, soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Just the wind," she muttered to herself, though she didn't entirely believe it. Hours passed before she found it. The trees suddenly parted, revealing a clearing bathed in an eerie silver light. In the center lay the pond, perfectly still and impossibly clear. It was smaller than she had imagined, but its presence was overwhelming. It felt alive. Elena approached cautiously, her boots crunching on the soft grass. Kneeling at the edge of the pond, she peered into its surface. At first, she saw only her reflection, pale skin, dark curls, eyes wide with apprehension. But as she stared, the image began to shift. The water rippled faintly, though no breeze disturbed it, and her reflection dissolved. In its place, she saw a scene from her childhood. She was 6 years old, playing in a meadow with her mother. They were picking wildflowers, laughing as the summer sun warmed their skin. It was a memory Elena had long forgotten, but now it felt vivid and real. She could almost smell the flowers and feel the grass beneath her fingers. Tears welled in her eyes. "I remember this," she whispered, but the scene changed again. Now she was older, perhaps 10, sitting on the porch of their house. Her mother was there too, her face shadowed with worry. They were arguing, though Elena couldn't hear the words. Her younger self stormed off, slamming the door behind her. Elena blinked, confused. She didn't remember this argument at all. The pond rippled again, faster now, and another memory surfaced. This one was darker. She was a teenager, crying in her room. Her mother stood in the doorway, trying to comfort her, but Elena yelled something, a sharp, cutting remark that made her mother flinch. "No," Elena murmured, shaking her head. "I didn't say that." But deep down, she knew it was true. As the memories continued to unfold, Elena began to feel a strange weight pressing down on her. The pond wasn't just showing her forgotten moments. It was forcing her to confront them. The joy, the pain, the guilt. It was all laid bare. She saw herself as a child, wandering too close to the edge of a river while her mother screamed for her to stop. She saw the quiet sacrifices her mother had made. working late into the night to pay for school supplies, skipping meals so Elena could eat, and she saw the moment her mother had collapsed in the kitchen, clutching her chest. Elena had been there, but she hadn't called for help right away. She'd thought it was just another dizzy spell, another moment that would pass. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The guilt she had buried for years came flooding back, suffocating her. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The pond rippled once more, and her own reflection returned. But this time, it wasn't the version of herself she recognized. The face staring back was older, worn, and lined with sorrow. Elena scrambled back from the edge, her heart racing. She understood now why the villagers feared the pond. It didn't just reflect forgotten memories. It unearthed the truths people weren't ready to face. But as she sat there trembling, a strange sense of clarity began to take hold. The memories hurt, yes, but they also felt like a gift. She saw her mother's love, her sacrifices, and even their arguments in a new light. Elena wiped her tears and stood. She looked back at the pond, its surface calm and unyielding once more. "Thank you," she said softly. The pond didn't respond, but she felt its presence, almost as if it were acknowledging her. When Elena returned to the village, she was different. The weight of her grief had lifted, replaced by a quiet resolve. She spent the following weeks reconnecting with her past, visiting her mother's favorite places, reaching out to old friends, and writing down the memories the pond had shown her. The villagers noticed the change. "You found it, didn't you?" the elderly man at the store asked one day. Elena nodded. "I did. It's not what people think. It's more than that." He smiled knowingly. "The pond gives what it takes, but not everyone's willing to pay the price." Elena thought of the memories, the guilt, and the pain she had faced. The price had been steep, but it was worth it. And though she never returned to the Whispering Woods, she carried the lessons of the pond with her, knowing that some truths, no matter how painful, were worth remembering. The crypt lay on the outskirts of Ashwick, a village shrouded in mist and old superstitions. No one ventured near it, not the farmers, not the shepherds, not even the most daring of children. It was said that the dead who rested there were not truly at peace. Those brave or foolish enough to step into its shadow claimed to hear whispers rising from the depths, voices that carried sorrow, anger, and secrets long buried. The villagers called it the Vault of Echoes. Elias Wren hadn't planned to return to Ashwick. The village had been his childhood home, a place of fond memories tainted by the shadow of his mother's sudden disappearance when he was 10 years old. She had been the light of his life, and when she vanished without a trace, it was as though someone had stolen the sun. Now in his late 20s, Elias found himself drawn back to the village when a letter from a distant cousin informed him of his father's passing. He hadn't spoken to his father in years, their relationship strained by bitterness and grief. Yet duty called him back to settle the estate. The village looked just as he remembered. Narrow cobblestone streets, gray stone cottages, and the ever-present mist that curled around every corner. The only thing that had changed was him. He felt like an outsider here now, his polished city shoes clacking loudly against the ancient streets. As he walked past the village inn, he overheard two old men whispering about the crypt. "They say it's louder these days," one of them muttered. "Ever since the blood moon last month," the other replied. "More voices than ever before. They say the dead are restless." Elias quickened his pace, their words gnawing at his curiosity. The crypt had been a part of Ashwick for centuries, a sprawling underground labyrinth carved into the hillside. Generations of the village's dead had been laid to rest there, some in grand tombs, others in simple stone niches. Legends about the crypt abounded, but one detail remained constant: the voices. When Elias was a boy, he'd heard the stories. The dead would speak to anyone who dared to enter, whispering fragments of their lives, regrets, and mournings. His mother had once told him that the crypt held memories, echoes of lives that refused to fade entirely. It's a place where the past lingers, she had said, her voice soft and reverent. But some things are better left undisturbed. Her words came rushing back to him the night he visited his childhood home for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The house was cold and empty, filled with dust and silence. As he sifted through his father's belongings, he found an old weathered journal. Inside, scrawled in his father's handwriting, was a single haunting entry. "I hear her voice. It's coming from the crypt. I must go." Elias's heart raced. Was this why his father had become so withdrawn after his mother's disappearance? Had he truly believed she was in the crypt? The next evening, armed with nothing but a lantern and his growing curiosity, Elias made his way to the crypt. The villagers watched him with wary eyes but said nothing. It was as if they knew where he was going and had already resigned themselves to his fate. The entrance to the crypt was as foreboding as he remembered. 2 stone doors, weathered by time, bore an inscription in a language he didn't recognize. He hesitated, the weight of the legends pressing down on him, but then he pushed the doors open. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of decay. The stone walls were lined with alcoves, each holding the remains of someone long gone. The deeper he ventured, the quieter the world outside became, until the only sound was the echo of his footsteps. And then the whispers began. At first the voices were faint, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as Elias descended further into the crypt, they grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of murmurs. He couldn't make out individual words, but the tone was unmistakable. Grief, longing, and despair. It was as though the dead were trying to tell him something, their voices rising and falling like a mournful symphony. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. For a moment the whispers ceased. The silence was deafening. Then a single voice broke through, clear and familiar. "Elias?" His breath caught. "Mother?" The voice came again, soft and mournful. "Elias, why did you forget me?" Tears welled in his eyes. "I didn't forget you. You left. You disappeared. I never knew why." The whispers surged around him, growing louder, angrier. Shadows seemed to shift along the walls and the air grew colder. "You must find the truth," the voice said. "You must see." Guided by the voice, Elias ventured deeper into the crypt, into a section that seemed untouched by time. The walls were lined with ancient carvings and the whispers became almost unbearable. Finally, he reached a chamber at the heart of the crypt. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and atop it lay an object wrapped in cloth. Trembling, he unwrapped it to reveal an old locket. It was his mother's. The moment he touched it, memories flooded his mind, memories he had long suppressed. He saw his mother arguing with his father late at night, her voice filled with desperation. He saw her packing a bag, tears streaming down her face, and then he saw her entering the crypt, clutching the locket. But the memory didn't end there. He saw his father following her, shouting her name. He saw the 2 of them struggling near the edge of a deep pit within the crypt. And then he saw the unthinkable, his father pushing her. Elias stumbled back, his heart pounding. The whispers around him turned into wails, the voices of the dead crying out in anguish. The locket grew warm in his hand, and the voice of his mother came again, softer this time. "Now you know the truth, my son. Do not let his sins define you." Elias fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. The man he had hated for so many years, the man he had blamed for being cold and distant, had carried the weight of this secret. And his mother, the woman he had adored, had never truly left him. She had been here all along, her memory bound to the crypt. As the whispers began to fade, Elias rose to his feet. He left the locket on the pedestal and made his way back to the surface. The air outside felt fresh and clean, and for the first time in years he felt lighter. Elias didn't tell the villagers what he had found in the crypt. Some secrets he realized were meant to stay buried, but he stayed in Ashwick, dedicating his life to preserving the history of the village and its crypt. And sometimes, late at night, he would return to the entrance of the Vault of Echoes and listen. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, a reminder that the past never truly fades. But among the voices, he always heard hers, a soft, guiding presence that reminded him he was never alone. The village of Eventide was a strange place, whispered of in legends and feared by travelers. No maps showed its location, and no roads led to its gates. Yet those who had lost their way on the misty moors swore by its existence. They spoke of warm fires, kind faces, and a haven that appeared just when all hope seemed lost. But they always ended their tales with the same chilling truth. The village was gone by dawn, leaving behind nothing but an empty field. Mara Lindsley didn't believe in legends. She was a practical woman, a writer who made her living exposing the truth behind folklore. She'd traveled far and wide, uncovering the roots of tales that others swore were real. So when she first heard about Eventide, she dismissed it as another rural myth. "It's just a story to scare off tourists," she told the barkeep at the tavern in the nearby town of Alderlow. The barkeep, a grizzled man with clouded eyes, leaned closer. "You think so, do you? You wouldn't be the first, but you'd do well to heed the warnings. Eventide ain't a place for the curious. It's for the lost. And not everyone who finds it comes back." Mara smirked, draining her ale. "I'm not afraid of ghost stories." The barkeep shook his head and muttered under his breath as she left. 2 nights later, Mara found herself trudging through the moors, a storm brewing overhead. The sky was a deep, bruised gray, and the wind howled like a living thing. She had set out to follow the vague directions she'd gathered from the townsfolk, determined to find the truth about Eventide. The moors were treacherous, dotted with hidden bogs and uneven terrain. As the sun set, Mara realized she was hopelessly lost. Her lantern flickered in the growing darkness, and the storm clouds swallowed the last vestiges of daylight. Just as panic began to creep in, she saw it, a faint glow on the horizon. It was soft and golden, like the light of a distant hearth. Heart pounding, she followed the light. It grew brighter as she approached, revealing the outlines of buildings shrouded in mist. The village was picturesque, nestled in a shallow valley surrounded by tall, swaying grasses. Stone cottages with thatched roofs lined cobblestone streets, and every window glowed warmly, invitingly. Smoke curled from chimneys, carrying the scent of wood smoke and baking bread. As Mara stepped into the village, she felt an odd sensation, a tingling, as though the air itself recognized her presence. A woman in a simple dress greeted her at the edge of the village. "Welcome to Eventide, traveler," she said with a smile. Her voice was soothing, yet it held an undercurrent of something Mara couldn't quite place. "I was lost on the moors," Mara said, her voice trembling with relief. "Thank you for—" The woman cut her off gently. "You're safe now. Eventide welcomes all who are lost. Come, rest. The night is cold, but our hearts are warm." Mara hesitated but followed the woman deeper into the village. The villagers were kind, almost unnervingly so. They offered Mara food and drink, and she found herself seated at a long wooden table in the village's communal hall. Around her, the villagers laughed and talked, their faces glowing in the firelight. Mara listened carefully to their conversations, trying to catch any hints of the mystery surrounding the village. But no one spoke of the stories, the disappearances, or the warnings she had heard in Alderlow. As the night wore on, Mara noticed something strange. The villagers didn't seem to tire. Their laughter remained lively, their faces unchanging. She chalked it up to her own exhaustion, but a nagging unease settled in her chest. One villager, a young boy with bright eyes, approached her as she was leaving the hall. You should leave before sunrise, he whispered. His voice was urgent, his small hand clutching her sleeve. What do you mean? Mara asked, but the boy darted away before she could get an answer. Mara was given a small cottage to sleep in, its bed soft and warm, but her mind raced, replaying the boy's warning. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Hours passed and she lay awake, listening to the faint hum of the village outside. As the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, a strange sound filled the air, a low, mournful hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Mara rushed to the window, her heart pounding. The village was changing. The golden glow of the cottages began to fade, replaced by an eerie, translucent light. The cobblestones cracked and crumbled, turning to dust. The villagers, too, began to shift. Their laughter died away, replaced by silence. Their forms grew faint, like smoke dissipating in the wind. Mara stumbled outside, her eyes wide with horror. "What's happening?" she shouted. The woman who had greeted her stood nearby, her features ghostly and pale. "This is our curse," she said softly. "Eventide exists only at night, a refuge for the lost. But when the sun rises, we are pulled back into the void." "Why?" Mara demanded. "Why are you trapped like this?" The woman looked at her with sad eyes. "We were once a village like any other, but long ago we made a bargain, a pact to protect ourselves from the horrors of the outside world. In exchange, we were bound to the night, to the shadows. Now we are neither alive nor dead." Mara's mind raced. "But I'm not part of this village. I can leave, can't I?" The woman hesitated. "If you leave before the village vanishes, yes. But if you remain, you will become one of us." Panic gripped Mara as the light of dawn grew brighter. The village was dissolving around her, the buildings crumbling into nothingness. She ran, her breath ragged, her legs trembling. The edge of the village seemed impossibly far, the mist closing in around her. Just as the sun broke fully over the horizon, Mara crossed the boundary of the village. She collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air. When she looked back, the village was gone. In its place was an empty field, silent and still. For a moment she thought she heard faint laughter on the wind, but it was quickly swallowed by the quiet. Mara returned to Alderlow, her mind reeling from what she had experienced. She tried to write about Eventide, to capture its strange beauty in the sorrow of its people. But no words seemed sufficient. Over time, she came to understand the truth of what the barkeep had said. Eventide wasn't just a place for the lost, it was the lost, a village suspended between worlds, a home for those who could never truly go home. And though she never returned to the moors, she carried the memory of Eventide with her, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some places are meant to disappear with the dawn. The legend of the Liminal Trail was one of whispers and fireside tales, spoken of by travelers and hermits alike. It was said to appear only to those who were truly lost, those who had wandered too far, strayed too deeply, or had nowhere left to turn. The stories differed on what awaited at the trail's end. Some claimed it led to safety, a refuge for the weary. Others believed it was a trick, a path to oblivion that preyed on the desperate. Eleanor Gray didn't believe in such tales, not until the day she found herself standing at the entrance to the trail, her breath fogging in the chill air, her heart pounding with equal parts fear and hope. Eleanor was a seasoned hiker, no stranger to the wilderness. She had spent years exploring remote trails, documenting her journeys for her blog and her growing audience. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a solo trek through the Silver Pine Forest, a place known for its dense woods and misty valleys. The first 2 days were uneventful, filled with the soothing sounds of birdsong and the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. But on the third day, a storm rolled in without warning. The skies turned an ominous gray, and rain began to pour in relentless sheets. Her map quickly became useless, the ink smudged and illegible. The GPS on her phone was no help either, the signal lost in the vast wilderness. Eleanor tried to retrace her steps, but the storm had turned familiar paths into muddy, unrecognizable terrain. By the time the rain stopped, the sun was setting, and Eleanor realized she was hopelessly lost. As darkness fell, Eleanor found herself standing in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to close in on her. The air was unnaturally still, the usual sounds of the forest, chirping insects, rustling leaves, conspicuously absent. She lit her lantern and tried to calm her racing thoughts. That's when she saw it. A trail stretched before her, cutting through the dense trees. It hadn't been there moments before. She was certain of it. The path was narrow, lined with stones that glowed faintly in the dim light. Eleanor hesitated. There was something otherworldly about the trail, something that sent a shiver down her spine. But what choice did she have? She was lost, and this trail, this strange, sudden trail, was the only sign of direction she had. Gripping her lantern tightly, she stepped onto the path. The trail wound deeper into the forest, its glowing stones casting an eerie, pale light. As she walked, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows shifted in the periphery of her vision, and every so often, she thought she heard whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath her feet. The forest around her seemed to change as she walked. The trees grew taller and older, their gnarled branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out the stars. Moss and vines covered the trunks, and the air grew colder with each step. Time felt strange on the trail. Hours seemed to pass in the blink of an eye, while minutes stretched into eternity. Eleanor's watch had stopped working, and her lantern never dimmed, no matter how long she walked. As the trail twisted and turned, the whispers grew louder. They began to form words, though Eleanor wished they hadn't. "You're lost," one voice hissed, low and mournful. "Turn back," another warned, its tone sharp and urgent. "This is not your path," a third voice said, filled with sorrow. Eleanor tried to ignore them, focusing on the path ahead. But the voices persisted, their tones shifting between anger, pity, and pleading. "Why are you here?" one voice asked, so close it made her jump. "I don't know," Eleanor shouted, her voice echoing through the forest. "I'm lost. I just want to go home." The whispers fell silent. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then a single voice spoke, soft and calm. "Then follow and see where the path takes you." The trail eventually led Eleanor to a crossroads, a place where three paths diverged. At the center of the crossroads stood a tree unlike any she had ever seen. Its bark was silver, and its branches glowed with a soft, golden light. Beneath the tree was a pool of water, perfectly still and reflecting the starless sky above. Eleanor approached the tree cautiously. As she drew closer, the water in the pool began to ripple, and images appeared on its surface. The first image showed a warm, cozy cabin nestled in a snowy valley. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a figure stood at the door, waving to her. It was a vision of safety, a place where she could rest and recover. The second image showed a bustling city street, filled with familiar landmarks. It was her home, her life before she became lost. The third image showed the trail continuing into the forest, disappearing into darkness. A voice spoke, this time from the tree itself. "Three paths lie before you," it said, its tone deep and resonant. "Choose wisely, for your choice cannot be undone." Eleanor stared at the images, her mind racing. The cabin was tempting, so tempting. She was exhausted, cold and scared, and the thought of a safe haven was almost too much to resist. But something about it felt final, like a place where she would remain forever. The vision of home tugged at her heart. It was what she wanted most, wasn't it? To return to her life, her friends, and her family. But the third path, the continuation of the trail, called to her in a different way. It was unknown, mysterious, and possibly dangerous. Yet it felt like the only path that truly belonged to her. After a long moment, Eleanor made her choice. She stepped onto the third path. The trail grew darker as she walked, the glowing stones fading to a dim flicker. The forest seemed to close in around her, the air thick with an otherworldly presence. Finally, the trail ended, opening into another clearing. At its center was a mirror, tall and framed in gold. Eleanor approached it cautiously, her reflection staring back at her. But the reflection wasn't quite right. It looked like her, but older, wiser, and with a calmness in her eyes that Eleanor didn't feel. The reflection spoke. "You were never lost," it said. "You were searching, and now you've found what you need." "I don't understand," Eleanor said. "The trail appears to the lost," the reflection said. "But being lost is not about where you are. It's about who you are. This path has shown you the truth of yourself. You are stronger than you think, braver than you know, and ready to face whatever lies ahead." The mirror shimmered and the reflection vanished. When Eleanor stepped out of the clearing, she found herself back at the edge of the moors. The storm was gone, the sun rising over the horizon. She looked behind her, but the trail was nowhere to be seen. Eleanor smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. She wasn't lost anymore, not in the moors and not in her life. The trail had shown her the way forward, even if it wasn't the path she had expected. And though she never found the trail again, she carried its lessons with her, knowing that sometimes the only way to find yourself is to lose your way first. There was a carnival that came to town once every 10 years. It wasn't like other carnivals with bright lights and cheery music. This one arrived quietly, the rumble of its trucks like a low growl on the horizon. By the time the sun rose, its black and gold tent stood on the outskirts of town, and word of its arrival spread like wildfire. The carnival was called the Labyrinth of Illusions, and its centerpiece attraction was a mirror maze, one that everyone whispered about but few dared enter. Some claimed it showed your soul, others said it revealed your future. But those who spent too long inside were never the same when they came out. Lila was one of the first to hear about the carnival. She worked at a local diner and overheard a group of teenagers talking about it between bites of greasy burgers. They were excited, daring each other to visit the maze. "You think it's real?" one of them asked, a nervous tremor in his voice. "Of course it's real," said another, grinning. "My cousin went in last time it came to town. Said it was weird, like the mirrors knew stuff about her." Lila wiped down the counter, pretending not to listen. But curiosity bloomed in her chest. She had always been drawn to the strange and mysterious, and this carnival sounded like the perfect escape from her humdrum life. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lila made her way to the carnival grounds. The air was thick with the scent of fried dough and something else, something metallic and sharp that made her skin prickle. She wandered through the carnival, passing games and rides that seemed both familiar and strange. There was a Ferris wheel, but its lights were dimmer than they should have been, and its cars creaked ominously as they spun. A clown juggled flaming torches, but his painted smile seemed more sinister than cheerful. At the center of it all stood the mirror maze. The structure was enormous, its entrance framed by two towering, warped mirrors that reflected the carnival grounds in unsettling distortions. A sign above the entrance read, "The Labyrinth of Illusions, face yourself." A man in a black suit and top hat stood by the entrance, his pale face blank and expressionless. "One at a time," he said as Lila approached. "Once you enter, there's no turning back until you reach the end." Lila hesitated, her heart pounding, but her curiosity won out. She handed over her ticket and stepped inside. The air inside the maze was cool, almost cold, and the faint smell of dust lingered. Mirrors lined every wall, stretching endlessly in every direction. At first they seemed ordinary, reflecting her image back at her as expected. But as she ventured deeper, the reflections began to shift. In one mirror she saw herself as a child, her hair in messy pigtails, holding the stuffed rabbit she had lost years ago. In another she appeared older, her face lined with wrinkles, her eyes filled with a sadness she didn't understand. She tried to dismiss them as clever tricks, illusions created by the maze to unsettle her. But the farther she went, the stranger the reflections became. In one mirror, her reflection smiled at her, even though she wasn't smiling. In another, it turned away, staring into the endless maze behind her. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing off the glass. Her reflection in the nearest mirror tilted its head, studying her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice a distorted version of her own. Lila stumbled back, her heart racing. "What is this place?" The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed down a hallway to her left. Lila followed the path, her steps slow and cautious. The mirrors on either side showed scenes from her past, moments she had forgotten, memories she had tried to bury. There was the time she had stolen a bracelet from her best friend in middle school, the guilt gnawing at her for weeks until she secretly returned it. There was the fight with her mother, the cruel words she had hurled in anger, words she could never take back. "Why are you showing me this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The mirrors didn't answer. At last, she reached the center of the maze. The room was circular, its walls made entirely of mirrors. In the center stood a single pedestal, and atop it was a mirror unlike the others. Its frame was ornate, carved with twisting vines and faces that seemed to watch her. She approached it hesitantly, her reflection coming into view. But it wasn't her. The figure in the mirror looked like her, but its eyes were darker, colder. It smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that didn't reach its eyes. "Who are you?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm you," the reflection said. "Or rather, I'm the part of you you don't want to see." "I don't understand." The reflection stepped closer, as if the glass was no barrier at all. "This maze doesn't just show reflections, it shows truths, the things you hide from, the parts of yourself you bury. That's why people fear it." Lila shook her head. "That's not true. I've made peace with my past." The reflection laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. "Have you? Then why are you here wandering through a maze searching for answers you already have?" The reflection raised a hand, and suddenly, the mirrors around the room shifted. Each one now showed a different version of Lila, a younger Lila, an older Lila, a Lila who had made different choices, lived different lives. "You can choose," from the reflection said. "Step into one of these mirrors and you can become her. Leave your regrets behind, start fresh. Or you can finish the maze and leave as you are, carrying the weight of your choices." Lila's head spun. The possibilities were endless, each reflection showing a life that could have been hers. A life where she had stayed with her first love, a life where she had pursued her dream of becoming an artist, a life where she had never hurt the people she cared about. But as tempting as they weren't real. They weren't her. "I don't want to be anyone else," she said, her voice steady. "I'll take my life, with all its flaws." The reflection smiled, this time warmly. "Then go. The maze has no hold over you." The mirrors shimmered and shifted, forming a clear path to the exit. Lila walked down it, her heart lighter than it had been in years. When she stepped out of the maze, the carnival was gone. The field was empty. The only sign of the carnival's presence, a faint smell of fried dough lingering in the air. Lila looked back at the empty field, a small smile on her lips. The maze had shown her what she needed to see, and though it had been terrifying, she was grateful. She would carry its lessons with her, knowing that sometimes the scariest thing to face is the truth about yourself. The old Ashcroft Manor loomed at the edge of town like a decaying sentinel, its pointed gables and cracked windows giving it the appearance of a Gothic crown. For decades it had been abandoned, its once manicured gardens now choked with weeds and brambles. Few dared to approach it, and even fewer would speak of the strange events rumored to have taken place there. But for Margaret Maggie Greer, the manor represented opportunity. Maggie was an antiques dealer, always on the hunt for rare and valuable items to sell to her clients. When she heard that the manor's current owner, a reclusive man named Edwin Hartwell, was selling its contents before demolishing the house, Maggie knew she had to visit. Stories of hauntings didn't scare her, they only added to the allure. What she didn't expect was the centerpiece of her visit, a massive crystal chandelier hanging in the grand foyer. Maggie received the invitation in the form of a handwritten note, delivered to her shop by a courier. It was an elegant thing, written in precise, looping handwriting on thick parchment paper. Ms. Greer, you are cordially invited to Ashcroft Manor to inspect and bid on its remaining antiques. Please arrive by noon on Saturday. Do not linger after nightfall. The warning struck her as odd, but Maggie chalked it up to superstition. She had heard the rumors about the manor, of course. Whispers of ghosts and curses, of screams heard in the night. But she was a woman of logic, not folklore. So on Saturday morning, she packed her ledger and notebook, grabbed her camera, and set off for Ashcroft Manor. The manor was more imposing up close. Its weathered facade seemed to glare down at her as she approached the massive oak doors. Edwin Hartwell, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and pale eyes, greeted her with a curt nod. "The items are yours to inspect," he said, leading her into the grand foyer. "Take what you wish, but," his voice faltered, "be gone before nightfall." Maggie dismissed his warning with a polite smile and turned her attention to the room. Dust motes danced in the beams of light streaming through the cracked windows, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. Her eyes were immediately drawn to the chandelier. It was enormous, its countless crystals sparkling like frozen teardrops. The wrought iron frame was intricately carved with twisting vines and tiny faces, their expressions frozen in what looked like agony. Despite the grime coating the rest of the room, the chandelier gleamed, as if it had been polished recently. "Magnificent," Maggie murmured, stepping beneath it. But as she gazed up, she felt a faint chill crawl down her spine. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the faces carved into the frame moved, their expressions shifting ever so slightly. She shook off the feeling and began taking notes. As the day wore on, Maggie explored the rest of the manor, cataloging ornate furniture, gilded mirrors, and faded tapestries. But nothing compared to the chandelier. "Is it for sale?" she asked Edwin as they stood in the foyer. He hesitated. You don't want it. Why not?" "There's something wrong with it," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Every night at midnight, it drips blood." Maggie blinked, unsure if he was serious. "Blood? You're joking." "I wish I were," he said. "It's cursed. My family tried to remove it once, but..." His voice trailed off and his gaze shifted to the floor. "It's better left alone." But Maggie didn't believe in curses. She believed in profit. "I'll take it," she said. Edwin stared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and pity. "You don't understand?" "I'll take it," she repeated firmly. The chandelier was delivered to Maggie's shop that evening. She instructed her assistant James to install it in the showroom, ignoring his protests about the eerie faces carved into the frame. "It's just an antique," she said. "Nothing to worry about." That night, as the clock struck midnight, Maggie woke to a faint dripping sound. At first, she thought it was rain, but when she glanced out the window, the sky was clear. The sound was coming from the showroom. Curious, she grabbed a flashlight and made her way downstairs. The chandelier hung in the center of the room, its crystals gleaming in the moonlight. But as Maggie stepped closer, she froze. Dark red droplets were falling from the chandelier, splattering onto the polished wooden floor. Her heart raced as she raised the flashlight. The liquid dripped from the carved faces, pooling in tiny streams that trickled down the iron frame. The smell of iron filled the air. Maggie staggered back, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. "It's not possible," she whispered. The faces on the chandelier seemed to shift, their mouths opening in silent screams. The next day, Maggie scrubbed the floor clean and convinced herself it was some kind of prank. Perhaps Edwin had rigged the chandelier to drip something as a way to scare her. But the following night, it happened again, and the night after that. By the end of the week, Maggie was exhausted. She hadn't slept, her dreams plagued by visions of the chandelier and the faces carved into its frame. She began to notice other strange occurrences, faint whispers when she was alone, shadows that moved in the corners of her vision. Desperate for answers, she began researching the history of Ashcroft Manor and its cursed chandelier. Maggie discovered that the chandelier had been commissioned by the first owner of Ashcroft Manor, a man named Silas Ashcroft. A wealthy merchant, Silas had been obsessed with immortality. He hired a reclusive artist to craft the chandelier, instructing him to embed it with powerful symbols and rituals. But the artist was no ordinary craftsman. He was a practitioner of dark magic, and the chandelier became a vessel for his experiments. The faces carved into its frame were said to be the souls of those Silas had wronged. Servants, rivals, even his own family members. Their blood was used to power the rituals, and when Silas died, the chandelier became cursed, a relic of his cruelty. By the time Maggie finished her research, she was at her breaking point. She couldn't sell the chandelier, not after what she had learned, but she couldn't keep it either. Determined to break the curse, she decided to destroy it. She waited until midnight when the dripping began. Armed with a sledgehammer, she stood beneath the chandelier, her hands trembling. The faces stared down at her, their expressions twisted with anger and despair. "I'm ending this," she said through gritted teeth. She swung the hammer, shattering one of the crystals. A piercing scream echoed through the room, and a wave of cold air knocked her off her feet. The faces on the chandelier began to writhe, their mouths opening and closing in silent agony. Blood poured from the iron frame, pooling around Maggie as she struggled to stand. With one final swing, she struck the base of the chandelier. The entire structure collapsed, the crystals shattering into 1,000 pieces. When the police arrived the next morning, they found Maggie unconscious on the floor of her shop. The chandelier was gone, reduced to a pile of broken glass and twisted metal. Maggie woke in the hospital, her memories hazy. She told the police it had been an accident, but deep down she knew the truth. The curse was broken, but it had come at a cost. For weeks after, she dreamed of the faces in the chandelier, their anguished cries echoing in her mind. And though the chandelier was gone, Maggie could never escape the feeling that its curse still lingered, watching her from the shadows. The ring was discovered in a dusty box at the back of an antique shop on a dreary November afternoon. It was a simple thing at first glance, an old silver band, tarnished with age, with a small black stone embedded in its center. The stone shimmered faintly, as if catching a light that no one else could see. Catherine Reynolds, a curious collector of oddities and heirlooms, stumbled upon it while browsing the shop during her weekend stroll. The shopkeeper, a wiry old man with a hunchback and piercing gray eyes, seemed reluctant to sell it. "That ring isn't like the others," he said cryptically as she examined it. Catherine smiled politely. "I don't mind. It has character." The man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It shows truths best left buried. Be certain before you take it." Catherine, used to the theatrics of antique dealers trying to inflate the value of their wares, chuckled and handed him the money. I think I'll take my chances. That evening, Catherine sat in her cozy apartment, turning the ring over in her hands. The stone seemed to pulse faintly under the soft glow of her desk lamp, almost as if it were alive. On a whim, she slipped it onto her finger. The metal was icy cold, sending a shiver up her spine, but it fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. At first, nothing happened. Catherine laughed at herself for indulging in the old shopkeeper's ominous warnings. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ring, admiring how the black stone caught the light in strange, mesmerizing ways. Then the room grew cold. The warmth of her apartment seemed to drain away, replaced by a creeping chill that sank into her bones. Catherine sat up, her breath visible in the air, her heart pounding. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. Catherine recognized her immediately. It was Alice, her childhood best friend, the same Alice she had betrayed years ago. "No," Catherine whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." But the figure stepped closer, and Catherine could hear her voice, faint and accusing. "Why did you do it, Cat? Why did you lie?" Memories flooded Catherine's mind. She had stolen something from Alice once, a small act of jealousy that had spiraled into a devastating fallout. Alice had never recovered, and the guilt had haunted Catherine ever since. The apparition lingered for what felt like hours before fading into the shadows, leaving Catherine trembling and gasping for breath. The next day, Catherine couldn't bring herself to take off the ring. Despite the terror of the night before, she felt strangely compelled to keep it on. She told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of her subconscious, but deep down she knew better. The ring didn't just reveal secrets, it forced her to confront them. At work, her colleagues noticed her distraction. Her boss, Mr. Larkin, called her into his office to discuss an overdue project. As he spoke, Catherine felt the familiar chill creeping over her. Suddenly, Mr. Larkin froze mid-sentence, his face pale. His eyes darted to the ring on her finger, and then he began to speak, not to Catherine, but to the empty space beside her. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he stammered, his voice shaking. "It was an accident. I swear." Catherine turned, horrified, and saw the faint outline of a young woman standing beside her. She didn't recognize the figure, but her presence was heavy, filled with sorrow and accusation. When the vision faded, Mr. Larkin slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. "What is that thing?" he whispered, staring at Catherine's ring with wide, terrified eyes. Catherine began to experiment with the ring, trying to understand its power. She discovered that it didn't just reveal her secrets, it revealed the darkest truths of anyone near her. Friends, strangers, even passers-by on the street. No one was immune. She learned of betrayals, regrets, and hidden sins. One woman in the grocery store broke down sobbing, confessing to a crime she had kept buried for decades. A man at the coffee shop stormed out after the vision of his estranged brother appeared, accusing him of abandonment. The ring seemed to feed on these moments, its black stone glowing brighter with each revelation. Catherine felt its pull more strongly every day, as though it had a will of its own. But the more she wore it, the more it took from her. Catherine began to notice changes in herself. Her reflection in the mirror looked older, more gaunt. Her eyes, once bright and curious, were now sunken and shadowed. The ring was consuming her, devouring her energy, her very soul. But she couldn't take it off. Every time she tried, the band seemed to tighten, burning her skin. The whispers in her mind grew louder, urging her to keep wearing it, to uncover more secrets. One night, unable to sleep, she sat in her dimly lit living room, staring at the ring. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. The flame of the candle on her coffee table flickered violently, and the room grew cold once more. This time, the figure that appeared wasn't a stranger, it was her mother. Her mother, who had died when Catherine was a teenager. Her mother, whose final moments had been filled with anger and disappointment over an argument they'd never resolved. Tears streamed down Catherine's face as the ghostly figure stared at her, silent but filled with unspoken words. The weight of guilt and regret crushed her chest, and she fell to her knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." But the figure only watched, fading away as the room grew warmer again. Catherine knew she couldn't keep the ring any longer. It was destroying her, piece by piece. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't remove it. Desperate, she returned to the antique shop, hoping the shopkeeper might have answers. But when she arrived, the shop was empty. Dust coated the counters and cobwebs hung from the shelves, as though no one had been there for years. She searched the shop, her heart racing, until she found a small note tucked beneath the counter. It read, "The ring reveals what is hidden, but the truth is a heavy burden. To be free, you must face your own darkness." Catherine stared at the note, her mind racing. She had already faced so many secrets, so much guilt. What more could the ring want from her? That night, she sat alone in her apartment, the ring heavy on her finger. She lit a candle and stared into its flame, letting the memories come. All the lies, the betrayals, the pain she had caused over the years. She didn't turn away, didn't try to deny them. As the hours passed, the black stone on the ring began to dim. The whispers faded, and the chill in the air dissipated. Finally, as dawn broke, the ring loosened on her finger, sliding off as easily as if it had never been stuck. Catherine placed it on the table and stared at it for a long time. She didn't know what to do with it, whether to destroy it or hide it away. In the end, she wrapped it in cloth and locked it in a small wooden box. She buried the box deep in the woods, vowing to leave it behind forever. But sometimes, late at night, she could still feel the weight of the ring on her finger, and she wondered if it was truly gone, or if it was simply waiting for someone else to find it. The candle arrived at the doorstep of the Holloway family home one stormy night. No one knew who had left it or why. It was wrapped in plain brown paper with no note, no markings, just a faint scent of wax and something metallic, almost like blood. Evelyn Holloway, a widow in her early 50s, found the package as she went to lock the door for the night. She hesitated at first, staring at the bundle as rain dripped from the porch roof. After a moment of curiosity, she picked it up and brought it inside, unwrapping it by the warm light of her kitchen. Inside was a single candle in a brass holder. Its wax was a deep crimson, and its wick, though untouched by flame, seemed blackened as though it had burned for hours. The brass holder was ornate, engraved with symbols Evelyn didn't recognize. Twisting, angular shapes that seemed to shift when she tried to focus on them. She placed the candle on the dining table, and after a brief thought, lit it. The flame sprang to life immediately, burning with a steady golden glow that illuminated the room far better than she'd expected. It flickered and danced like any ordinary flame, but something about it felt alive, as though it were watching her. Over the next few days, Evelyn found herself drawn to the candle. She kept it lit almost constantly, marveling at how it never melted or grew smaller, no matter how long it burned. She told herself it was simply a clever design, a trick wax or some modern invention. But strange things began to happen. The first night, she dreamed vividly of her late husband, Arthur. In the dream, he stood in their old garden, his hands outstretched and his face smiling, as though he were waiting for her. When she woke, the memory of the dream lingered, so clear it felt more real than her waking life. The next day, as she sat reading by the candle's light, she thought she heard whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from the flame itself. At first, she dismissed them as tricks of her imagination, but the whispers grew louder each time she was near the candle. They weren't threatening, at least not at first. They spoke her name, called to her gently, as though trying to comfort her. "Evelyn," they whispered. "Evelyn, don't you miss him?" By the end of the week, Evelyn could no longer deny that the candle was far from ordinary. Every night, the dreams grew more vivid, and every day, the whispers grew louder. The flame seemed to dance in response to her presence, flaring when she drew near and dimming when she moved away. And the memories it stirred, oh, the memories. The candle didn't just remind her of Arthur, it brought him back to her. As she sat in its warm glow, she remembered things she had long forgotten. The way he laughed, the way he held her hand on their walks, the way he kissed her forehead every morning. It was intoxicating. The more time she spent near the candle, the more she felt his presence, as though he were just beyond the edge of the flame, waiting for her to join him. But the cost soon became clear. One evening, Evelyn's daughter, Clara, came to visit. Clara immediately noticed how pale and tired her mother looked. Her cheeks were sunken, and dark circles rimmed her eyes. "Mom, are you feeling all right?" Clara asked, concern evident in her voice. Evelyn waved her off. "I'm fine, dear. Just a bit tired." Clara's gaze drifted to the candle on the table. "That's beautiful," she said, leaning closer to inspect it. "Where did you get it?" "I'm not sure," Evelyn admitted. "It just showed up." Clara frowned. "That's odd. And you've been keeping it lit this whole time?" Evelyn nodded. "It's comforting. It reminds me of your father." Clara's expression darkened. "Mom, you look like you haven't slept in days. Maybe you should put it out for a while." Evelyn's grip tightened on the edge of the table. "No," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "It stays." Clara recoiled, startled. "All right," she said softly. "I just think you need to take care of yourself." But Evelyn couldn't let it go. The candle had become her anchor, her connection to Arthur. She couldn't bear to extinguish it, not when it made her feel so close to him. As the days turned into weeks, Evelyn's condition worsened. She barely ate, barely slept. Her once rosy complexion had turned ashen, and her hands trembled constantly. The candle, however, burned brighter than ever, its golden light casting eerie shadows on the walls. The whispers became more demanding, more insistent. They no longer comforted her. They pleaded with her, begged her. "Join him, Evelyn," they said. "He's waiting for you. Don't you want to be together again?" One night, as she sat alone in the flickering glow, the whispers grew deafening. The flame flared, and for the first time she saw something within it. A figure, faint and wavering, but unmistakably Arthur. "Evelyn," the figure said, his voice echoing like a distant wind. "Come to me." Tears streamed down her face. "Arthur," she whispered, "I've missed you so much." "Then join me," he said, his hand reaching toward her from within the flame. "We can be together again. All you have to do is give yourself to the light." Evelyn reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered above the flame. The whispers urged her on, growing louder and louder. But just as her fingers grazed the heatless fire, a sudden knock at the door snapped her out of her trance. Clara burst in, her face pale with worry. "Mom, I've been calling you for days. What's going on?" Evelyn blinked as though waking from a dream. She looked at her daughter, then back at the candle. The figure of Arthur was gone, and the flame seemed smaller now, almost innocuous. "Clara," she said weakly. Clara didn't wait for an explanation. She marched to the table and snatched up the candle. "This thing is killing you," she said. "I'm getting rid of it." "No," Evelyn cried, lunging forward. But she was too weak to stop her daughter. Clara carried the candle outside and hurled it into the rain-soaked garden. The moment the candle hit the ground, the flame extinguished with a hiss. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. In the days that followed, she slowly began to recover. The whispers faded and the vivid dreams stopped. But a deep sadness lingered, an emptiness that nothing seemed to fill. The candle was gone, but Evelyn could still feel its pull, like a faint echo in the back of her mind. She knew it wasn't truly destroyed, only waiting. And somewhere, in the depths of its eternal flame, the figure of Arthur still lingered, his hand outstretched, waiting for her to return. In the quiet town of Hollow Creek, nestled between sprawling woods and rolling hills, life had always been peaceful. The town had little crime, few tragedies, and a rhythm that seemed unchanging. But one summer, something happened that shook the town to its core. It began with an unassuming toy. 8-year-old Ellie Simmons was the kind of child who could find treasure in the most ordinary places. That's how she came across the toy. An old, battered jack-in-the-box with peeling paint and a crank that stuck when turned. Ellie found it in the attic of her grandmother's house, buried under dusty blankets and forgotten keepsakes. The box was peculiar. Instead of the cheerful designs most jack-in-the-boxes had, this one was adorned with strange symbols and faded illustrations of clouds, fire, and falling stars. The clown inside, which popped out when the crank was turned, wore a faded smile and had one eye painted black. Ellie was enchanted by it. She loved the suspense of cranking the handle, waiting for the spring-loaded clown to leap out. She carried it everywhere, despite her grandmother's protests. "I don't remember that toy," her grandmother said one evening. "It must have been left behind by the previous owners." Ellie didn't care about its origin. It was hers now. The first incident happened a week after Ellie found the toy. She was playing with it in the living room, turning the crank slowly while humming to herself. As the clown popped out, Ellie giggled, but then something odd happened. The clown's head tilted slightly, and Ellie thought she heard it whisper something faint, almost like a hiss. "Car," it seemed to say. Ellie froze, staring at the toy. "Did you say something?" she whispered. The clown didn't move. Shaking off the moment, Ellie dismissed it as her imagination. That evening, as Ellie's parents drove home from the grocery store, their car skidded on the wet road and narrowly avoided a collision with a truck. When they returned home shaken but unharmed, Ellie couldn't help but remember the toy's strange whisper. Over the following days, the toy began to whisper more often. Each time Ellie cranked the handle and the clown popped out, it murmured a single word. "Fire," it said one morning. That afternoon, a kitchen towel left too close to the stove caught fire. Thankfully, Ellie's mother noticed in time to extinguish it. "Fall," it said another day. A few hours later, Ellie's friend Ben fell from a tree and broke his arm. At first, Ellie thought it was a coincidence, but as the whispers continued, she became convinced the toy wasn't ordinary. She tried telling her parents, but they laughed it off. "It's just a toy, Ellie," her father said. But Ellie knew better. Word about the toy spread after Ellie told her best friend Grace. Grace, who was always eager for a bit of excitement, dared Ellie to bring the toy to school. During recess, a group of children gathered around as Ellie cranked the handle. The clown popped out, and this time, the whisper was louder. "Water," it said. The children looked at each other, confused. That evening, a sudden storm caused the river to overflow, flooding parts of Hollow Creek. A local fisherman was swept away by the current, and his body wasn't found for days. News of the incident spread quickly, and soon the entire town was buzzing about Ellie's toy. Some dismissed it as nonsense, while others whispered about curses and magic. As the predictions became more frequent and more accurate, people began to fear the toy. Some begged Ellie to use it, hoping it would warn them of danger. Others avoided her, convinced the toy was cursed. Ellie felt trapped. She didn't want to give up her favorite toy, but the weight of its predictions was becoming unbearable. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, and sometimes she could hear them even when she wasn't playing with the toy. One night she woke up to find the jack-in-the-box sitting on her bedside table, though she was certain she had left it in the living room. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, staring at the clown's painted smile. The toy didn't answer. It all came to a head one fateful evening. The town was preparing for its annual summer festival, a celebration that brought everyone together. Ellie's parents were busy setting up booths, and the streets were alive with laughter and music. Ellie sat in her room, staring at the Jack-in-the-Box. She hadn't touched it in days, afraid of what it might say. But something compelled her to pick it up one last time. With trembling hands, she turned the crank. The tune played slowly, hauntingly, and when the clown popped out, its whisper was clear and cold. Death. Ellie dropped the toy and ran downstairs, her heart pounding. She tried to warn her parents, but they brushed her off, telling her not to worry. That night, as the festival reached its peak, a faulty electrical wire sparked a massive fire. The flames spread quickly, consuming the main square. Dozens of people were injured, and 3 lives were lost. Among the dead was Grace, Ellie's best friend. The fire left Hollow Creek scarred, both physically and emotionally. The townsfolk whispered about Ellie and her toy, blaming her for what had happened. Her parents, terrified and grieving, made her bury the Jack-in-the-Box in the woods. But even after it was gone, Ellie couldn't escape the feeling that the toy was still watching her. She dreamed of it often, hearing its whispers in the dark. Years later, as an adult, Ellie returned to Hollow Creek. The town had changed, but the memories of that summer haunted her. She visited the woods where she had buried the toy, half expecting to find it waiting for her. The ground where she had buried it was undisturbed, but as she turned to leave, she heard it, faint and distant, carried on the wind. Ellie! She never returned to the woods again. At the edge of a small, forgotten town named Black Hollow, there was a field known simply as the Wishing Field. A sea of tall, golden grass stretched endlessly, shimmering under the sun during the day and glowing faintly under the moonlight at night. For as long as anyone could remember, stories about the field had been passed down through generations. It was said that if someone walked to the very center of the field and made a wish, the field would grant it. But there was a price. The field always took something in return, though no one ever knew what it would take until it was too late. Some called it a blessing, others called it a curse. Most were too afraid to find out for themselves. One summer evening, a stranger arrived in Black Hollow. Her name was Clara Hargrove, a young journalist chasing unusual stories for her magazine. She had heard whispers of the Wishing Field in online forums and obscure articles, and had driven halfway across the country to see it for herself. Clara was skeptical, but intrigued. She had built her career on unraveling mysteries, and this field seemed like the perfect subject for her next feature. After checking into the town's single rundown inn, she headed to the local diner to gather information. The townsfolk were hesitant to talk. When she mentioned the Wishing Field, their faces grew tight, their gazes darting away. "Best to leave that place alone," one elderly man muttered, stirring his coffee. "Nothing good ever comes from it." A younger woman, sitting at the counter, scoffed. "Depends on who you ask. My cousin went there last year, wished for a fortune, and came back with a winning lottery ticket. And lost his wife in a car crash the next week," the old man snapped. The diner fell silent. "Did the field cause the crash?" Clara asked. "Who's to say?" the old man replied. "All I know is that every wish comes with a price. You might not notice it at first, but the field always takes something." That evening, Clara walked to the edge of the Wishing Field. The golden grass swayed gently in the breeze, whispering softly like it was alive. She stood there for a long time, staring at the horizon, where the field seemed to stretch forever. She didn't enter that night. Instead, she returned to the inn and pored over her notes, trying to piece together the field's history. What she found was a patchwork of legends and rumors. One story told of a farmer who wished for rain during a drought, only to lose his sight a week later. Another spoke of a woman who wished for beauty and soon after lost her voice. The field's gifts were real, but so were its costs. Clara didn't believe in magic, at least not until her second visit to the field. This time she stepped into the tall grass, her footsteps crunching softly beneath her. The further she walked, the quieter the world became. The sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. Eventually she reached the center of the field, a small clearing where the grass seemed shorter, almost bowing. The air felt different here, heavy, electric, as if the ground itself was waiting. Clara hesitated. She didn't know what to wish for. She wasn't wealthy, but she wasn't poor. She wasn't lonely, but she wasn't entirely happy either. Then her thoughts drifted to her younger brother, Michael. Michael had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive illness a year ago. His treatments weren't working, and his condition was worsening. Clara had done everything she could to help, but it wasn't enough. "I wish for my brother to be healed," she whispered, her voice trembling. The air around her seemed to pulse. For a moment the field grew impossibly bright, the golden grass glowing like fire. Then just as quickly, the light faded, and the world returned to normal. Clara stood there, her heart pounding. Nothing felt different. Had it worked? The next morning, Clara called her parents. "It's a miracle," her mother said, her voice choked with emotion. "Michael woke up this morning, and he's better. The doctors can't explain it, but they're saying the disease is gone." Clara felt a surge of relief and disbelief. It had worked. The field had granted her wish. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. First, she lost her sense of taste. She brushed it off at first, thinking it was stress or a cold. But then she realized she couldn't smell anything either. By the end of the week, her hearing began to fade. It started as a faint ringing, then grew worse until she could barely hear at all. Clara returned to the wishing field, desperate for answers. She stood in the center and shouted into the emptiness, "What have you done to me?" The field didn't answer, but she felt it, an unseen presence pressing against her mind, as if the field was watching her, judging her. Over the next month, Clara's senses continued to vanish. Her vision blurred, her sense of touch dulled, and soon she was left in a world of nothingness. She could no longer work, no longer enjoy the small pleasures of life. The price the field had taken was steep, but she couldn't bring herself to regret her wish. Michael was alive and healthy, and that was all that mattered. But one night, as she lay in bed, unable to sleep, she heard something, or rather felt it. A voice, faint and distant, whispering in her mind. "Come back," it said. Clara returned to the field one last time. Blind, deaf, and numb, she stumbled through the tall grass, guided only by memory. When she reached the clearing, she collapsed to her knees. "I want my senses back," she said, her voice trembling. "Take whatever you want. Just give them back." The field responded with silence. Clara sat there for hours, waiting, pleading, but no light came, no pulse of energy. The field had given her its gift, and it had taken its price. There was no bargaining. As the sun rose, Clara finally understood the truth. The field didn't care about fairness or morality. It simply was. A force of nature, granting and taking without reason. Clara left Black Hollow the next day, her senses still gone. She couldn't write, couldn't explain what had happened to her, but she didn't need to. Michael grew up healthy and strong, and Clara found solace in his happiness. Years later, when she passed away, Michael discovered her journal, a detailed account of the wishing field and the price she had paid for his life. Haunted by her sacrifice, he returned to Black Hollow, standing at the edge of the golden grass. He didn't step inside. Some gifts, he realized, were too costly to accept. At the far edge of the sleepy town of Maple Hollow, surrounded by a dense forest, stood a peculiar house. The locals called it Evermore Manor, a name that suggested permanence, but its true nature was anything but eternal. Evermore Manor had stood for over a century, and yet it always seemed temporary. Its wood never weathered, its bricks never cracked, and its windows shone as if freshly polished, no matter the season. It was said that the house borrowed time, a cryptic phrase whispered by the oldest in the town. To most, it was just an old superstition. To others, it was a warning. Few dared venture near it, and fewer still could explain the uneasy feeling it gave them. In the summer of 1993, the Bishop family moved into Evermore Manor. They weren't from Maple Hollow. They had driven across the country, seeking a fresh start after financial troubles had forced them to sell their home in the city. The house was a bargain, almost suspiciously so, but the Bishops were desperate, and the real estate agent reassured them that the house was in perfect condition. It was spacious, with 5 bedrooms, a grand staircase, and a backyard that stretched into the woods. "We'll make this place a home," said John Bishop, the father, as he unpacked boxes in the foyer. His wife, Linda, nodded, though she couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over her since they first saw the house. Their 2 children, 13-year-old Emma and 7-year-old Max, were less concerned. Emma was excited to finally have her own room, while Max was captivated by the mysterious attic. From the moment they moved in, odd things began to happen. At first, they were minor. The clocks in the house never kept the correct time, always running either too fast or too slow. Light bulbs flickered no matter how many times John replaced them. Then the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. One night, Linda woke to the sound of soft knocking. At first, she thought it was coming from the front door, but when she got up, she realized it was coming from inside the walls. She pressed her ear to the wall in the hallway and heard faint, rhythmic taps, as though someone or something was trying to get her attention. Max began talking about the man in the attic. "He watches me," Max said one morning at breakfast. "Who does?" Linda asked, her voice tense. "The man in the attic," Max replied, munching on his cereal as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "He's nice, though. He says he's just waiting." John brushed it off as a child's overactive imagination, but Linda couldn't ignore the cold shiver that ran down her spine. Emma was the first to uncover the house's secret. While exploring the basement one afternoon, she found an old dusty journal tucked away in a hidden compartment under the floorboards. The journal belonged to a man named Edgar Whitaker, the original owner of Evermore Manor. The entries were fragmented and cryptic. Edgar wrote about how the house had been gifted to him by a stranger who appeared at his door one stormy night. The stranger had offered him a life of prosperity and comfort in exchange for a simple promise. Edgar had to agree to borrow time from the house. At first, Edgar didn't understand what that meant, but over time he realized the house fed on something intangible, time itself. Every moment Edgar spent in the house came at a cost. He grew older faster, his days slipping away without warning. By the time he realized the truth, it was too late. The final entry in the journal read, "The house takes what it is owed. It always takes." Emma showed the journal to her parents, but John dismissed it as an old man's ramblings. Linda, however, was troubled. She couldn't ignore the strange way time seemed to shift in the house. Days passed in a blur, yet nights seemed to stretch endlessly. One evening, Linda decided to investigate the attic. She found Max sitting in the corner, humming to himself. "Max, what are you doing up here?" she asked. He turned to her and smiled. "Talking to the man." Linda's heart raced as she scanned the attic, but there was no one else there. "What man?" she whispered. Max pointed to a shadowed corner. "He's right there. He says we have to leave soon." Over the next few weeks, the house's hold on the family grew stronger. John began to age rapidly, his once dark hair turning gray almost overnight. Linda felt constantly exhausted, as though the house were draining her energy. Emma stopped going to school, her once vibrant personality replaced by a quiet, sullen demeanor. The clocks in the house began spinning wildly, their hands moving faster and faster. Shadows danced in the corners of rooms, even when there was no light to cast them. One night, as the family sat together in the living room, the house seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and a low guttural sound echoed through the halls. "We have to go," Linda said, her voice trembling. But when they tried to leave, the front door wouldn't budge. The windows wouldn't open, and the house seemed to shift around them, its layout twisting and changing like a labyrinth. Desperate, Linda remembered the journal. She flipped through its pages, searching for a way to escape. Near the back, she found a single line that seemed to glow faintly under the dim light. "To leave, you must offer the house something it values more than time." "What does that mean?" John asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," Linda replied, tears streaming down her face. Just then, Max spoke up. "The man in the attic says he'll help us if we promise to never come back." The family hesitated. They didn't understand what Max meant, but they had no other choice. "We promise," Linda whispered. The house groaned loudly, as if in protest, but the front door slowly creaked open. Without hesitation, the bishops ran, leaving everything behind. As they crossed the threshold, Linda glanced back and saw the house's windows glowing faintly, like watchful eyes. They never returned to Evermore Manor. The bishops moved to a small apartment in the city, far from Maple Hollow. Though they tried to put the experience behind them, the memories lingered. John never fully recovered. He remained frail and aged far beyond his years. Emma refused to talk about the house, and Max, though young, seemed to understand more than he let on. Years later, when Linda searched for information about Evermore Manor, she discovered that it no longer existed. The house had vanished without a trace, leaving only an empty field where it once stood. But sometimes, late at night, Linda swore she could hear the faint ticking of a clock, a reminder that the house, in its borrowed time, was still out there, waiting for its next occupants.